There are days when you can't even remember why you started, only that you gave too much of yourself to a place that never intended to hold space for you. My name is Kelly Preston. I'm 36, and I was once the creative director at one of Seattle's biggest media agencies. For 8 years at Sterling Rhodes Creative. I never missed a meeting, never let a campaign fail. I truly believed it was my second home, a place where I could leave my mark and build not only a legacy, but also lasting relationships in the field of emotional marketing. But perhaps I was wrong from the moment I believed loyalty was something that could be valued. I remember that spring morning vividly, standing in the boardroom on the 18th floor, presenting the see-through campaign to Velvet Echo. A fashion conglomerate, the campaign focused on authenticity and transparency in fast fashion, calling for more responsible consumer choices through real stories from workers, consumers, and designers. When the video ended, the room fell silent, then erupted into applause. I caught the quiet but content gaze of Charles Morton, the CEO, who once told me that if Sterling Rhodes were a stage, then I was the best director they'd ever had. That gaze was quickly interrupted by a faint chuckle from my left. I turned to see Ryan Caldwell, recently promoted to Executive Vice President, walking up with a USB drive in hand and a smile that suggested he had authored the entire idea. Ryan had once been my intern. I'd coached him through his first presentation slides, taught him how to read market share charts and choose campaign colors based on behavioral psychology. But he wasn't the apprentice anymore, in front of the whole room. Ryan represented everything I had just said, with some terms altered, a few concepts extracted, and then looked over to Charles to explain that this was part of his new restructure strategy for the company. I sat there, hand gripping a cold coffee cup, as former colleagues glanced at me with eyes that either avoided or no longer recognized me. I said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. The meeting ended with another round of applause, this time for Ryan. I walked into the hallway feeling like a blank sheet of paper crumpled at the edges. That night, I stayed in the office until almost midnight. No one texted to check on me, no email from management, no word of thanks. The next day, I received a meeting invite from HR with the subject personnel update. I knew what it meant, but I showed up anyway. It was just me, the head of HR, and Ryan. His voice was soft, even sympathetic, as he explained that due to the new development direction, my role as creative director would be merged with brand strategy, and because I was showing signs of overload, the company was granting me a reasonable period of leave. No one used the word termination, but the envelope on the table didn't lie. I walked home under Seattle's light drizzle, soaked and cold, my mind spinning. I said nothing to my mother, who was staying with me during early-stage cancer treatment. I said nothing to my boyfriend, who had just accepted a job in another state and had begun to drift. I sat quietly on the kitchen floor, opened a can of sparkling water, and stared at the fridge door. There was no more anger inside me, only a hollow space, as if everything had been drained and left behind an emptiness without name. 3 days later, I received an internal email announcing that See-Through had won the National Creative Media Award, and the recipient representing the company was Vice President Ryan Caldwell. I wasn't surprised. I didn't cry. I just felt something break, not my trust in others, but my trust in myself. I used to believe that if you worked hard, were truly skilled, and stayed ethical, things would naturally fall into place. But the truth doesn't always get chosen, especially in rooms where people care more about who's speaking than who wrote the words on the screen. That night, my mother asked if something had happened at work. because I had cooked dinner out of order, as if my thoughts were elsewhere. I didn't know how to answer, just stared at my hands and thought, this must be what it's like to hit bottom, not because of some explosive event, but because tiny cracks had spread deep enough to shake the entire foundation at the time. I didn't know that fall would be the beginning of everything, forcing me to revisit every betrayal, every moment I let someone else hold my worth. All I knew was that I couldn't sleep that night, and when I woke up the next morning, one question rang clear in my mind. If I'm no longer Kelly Preston from Sterling Rhodes, then who am I? The first signs never came as invitations or apologies, but rather in hesitant expressions, clipped messages, and glances that began to recognize a vacancy larger than they had expected on a Monday morning. While I was recording the third episode of my podcast on building a brand when no one believes in you, a message lit up my phone from an unknown number. The words were simple but weighty. Kelly, this is Sophie Allen, head of PR at Velvet Echo. When can we talk? I stopped recording right then. Velvet Echo was the same major client I had worked with before being sidelined. The same brand whose campaign, See Through, had won Ryan his award. I called her back, calm in voice, but with a quiet pulse beneath. Sophie got straight to the point. They had just concluded an emergency meeting after a series of online articles accused Sterling Rhodes of distorting the See Through campaign, using worker footage without full consent, and, most critically, failing to credit the actual creator. I wasn't surprised. I had always known Ryan had altered segments behind my back to enhance visual impact, disregarding the delicate and authentic recordings I had originally gathered. I had opposed it then, but objections carry no weight when you're no longer in the room. Velvet Echo wanted to know if I still had the original files. I did. Every piece had been stored on my personal hard drive, with metadata and timestamps intact. They suggested a meeting to discuss further, though I understood they were asking for help in escaping a potential PR disaster. I arranged to meet them the following afternoon at a cafe near Lake Union. Sophie arrived with 2 others, and no one said much. They just listened as I opened my laptop and played the unedited footage, including the scenes that had been cut, rescored, or stripped of context. By the 3rd minute, the man to Sophie's right turned to her and gave a silent nod. They told me they would follow up internally, but their eyes had already said what mattered. What I had kept was more than evidence. It was the truth they once believed in. 3 days later, a headline appeared in a leading industry outlet, award-winning campaign faces, creative copyright scrutiny, who really created See Through. The article didn't name me, but it no longer portrayed Ryan as the lone figure under the spotlight. The news spread quickly. The media world is smaller than people think, especially in Seattle. A week later, I received a call from Brandon Lee, a veteran journalist from a respected marketing publication. He asked if I wanted to speak out, to share my experience of rebuilding after a breach of trust. I declined a formal interview, saying only that I believed in revenge through success, not noise. Instead, I sent him a clip from my latest podcast, where I talked about what it feels like to see your idea handed to someone else, to stand backstage, watching the spotlight hit a person who never lost sleep for what you created. The episode was shared more than I expected, partly because my voice carried the weight of experience without resentment, and partly because it struck a quiet chord with countless creatives people who knew what it meant to be dismissed despite having laid the first brick. Around the same time, I received an email from a small agency in Portland. They were rebuilding after losing key contracts and needed someone who could navigate a media crisis. I agreed to help on a short-term basis. Studio Afterlight now had its first formal agreement, complete with signature, payment schedule, and a confidentiality clause. I worked in silence, no hiring posts, no project announcements, but small clients began referring me to others, and the circle widened. Meanwhile, Sterling and Rhodes had entered reactive mode. Trade articles began questioning their over-reliance on certain individuals and a lack of creative oversight. A former colleague sent me a photo from an internal meeting titled Reputation Management Task Force, showing both the CEO and Ryan in attendance. They could feel the flames, but didn't know where the fire had started. One afternoon, while reviewing documents for a new project, I received a message from a number not saved in my contacts. "Can we talk? It's Ryan." I stared at the screen for a long while, not surprised, only aware that this moment would come. Someone like Ryan only reaches out when every other path begins to close. I didn't reply immediately. The next day, he followed up with an email, this time with a company signature and a request for a candid, unbiased conversation to resolve some misunderstandings. I agreed to meet, but only in a public cafe, not their office, not any place tied to our shared past. We met on a rainy afternoon, in a space filled only with the clink of spoons and soft background jazz. Ryan looked more worn than I remembered, deep circles under his eyes, his hand trembling slightly as he lifted his cup. He began by saying things were slipping beyond control and they needed to regain partner trust. I didn't react, only looked at him and said, "The question isn't whether they trust the company, it's whether they ever trusted you." He sighed, tried to stay composed, then suggested that Sterling and Rhodes were considering a communications restructure and wanted to bring me back as an independent advisor to rebuild market confidence. I listened but didn't respond immediately. Instead, I asked, why would I help a system that once said I didn't belong? Ryan didn't answer. We sat for a few more minutes in silence. Then I left without making any promises. But I knew. That offer was another sign the game was starting to shift. The silence after meeting Ryan didn't bring relief, but felt instead like the stillness before a deeper storm. Not because I had any lingering attachment to my former company, but because I knew this was a moment to choose. I could remain quiet, watching from the sidelines, or I could step back in, not to fix what others had broken, but to create a new standard where real value was no longer traded for polished walls and hollow KPIs. I took a few days to think, choosing not to respond to Sterling and Rhodes just yet, and instead focusing on refining the strategic framework of Studio Afterlight. What I was building was no longer a patchwork of freelance projects for local brands, but a way of thinking that I wanted to teach, scale, and share in the middle of reviewing documents. I received a call from Andrea Myers, the head of strategy development for a media conglomerate in San Francisco. She had been one of the judges for the Creative Ethics Awards 3 years ago and remembered me after the recent headlines. Andrea explained that her company was launching an independent consulting division focused on responsible and ethical storytelling, and they were looking for someone to lead it. She said bluntly they didn't want someone who could just build brands, but someone who understood how to build trust from the smallest things. Her final question was, do you still want to be at the center of the board, or would you rather watch it collapse from the edges? I didn't answer right away. But that evening I stood at my window, looking out at the distant shimmer of the city, and realized I no longer felt fear. The anxieties that once surrounded me had lost their weight. I no longer feared betrayal because I had already been betrayed. I no longer feared theft because I had built something no one else could replicate. And when fear disappears, freedom returns. I opened my email and wrote back to Andrea, saying I was ready to meet and discuss the opportunity further. A part of me knew that was the moment I truly stepped out of the shadow of my past. But I had one more thing to do first. I called Sophie at Velvet Echo and asked if she'd be open to a long-term collaboration with Studio Afterlight, not as a subcontractor, but as a strategic partner. She didn't hesitate, honestly. We've been searching for a new direction, one that doesn't rely on oversized agencies with no soul. She said, "We signed the agreement 3 months later, officially naming Studio Afterlight as Velvet Echo's independent partner for emotional strategy and crisis communication across their full media ecosystem." The contract included clauses granting full editorial control and protecting the creative integrity of all deliverables. It took me nearly 2 days to write that clause, not because it was difficult, but because I needed to be certain no one could do to others what had once been done to me. News of my return wasn't a headline, but it drifted through the media industry like the first chill of autumn, subtle but unmistakable, a month later. Ryan emailed me an invitation to speak at the National Creativity Conference as a guest panelist. The theme was building sustainable relationships in the creative field. I didn't reject it, but I didn't accept either. I replied with one line, "Real relationships don't need a presentation deck to be proven." I don't know what he thought when he read that, but I knew I no longer needed an explanation from him. My re-entry came without fireworks, no new logos, no brand video, just a simple identity kit for Studio Afterlight and 3 sentences that I placed at the top of the website, on every brochure. And after every podcast, we don't make you stand out. We make you unforgettable. Not everyone needs to tell a story, but everyone deserves to be heard with respect. Revenge through success isn't about destroying someone. It's about building something that can't be repeated. On the 6-month anniversary of Studio Afterlight, I hosted a private gathering in the small co-working space where I rented a room. No press, no live streams, just a circle of small brands who had once been overlooked. Founders who had been pushed out of the very products they built. And people trying to find their voice in an industry that often drowned them out. I didn't stand before them as someone who had triumphed, but as someone who had once failed, who had been cast out by a company, who had lost faith in herself and had slowly learned how to return, not to retaliate, but to show there was another way to rise without stepping over anyone else. When the session ended, a young woman approached me, her voice trembling as she asked if she was too soft for this industry. Having just been let go after 6 months of unpaid internship, I didn't answer immediately. I looked into her eyes and gently asked, "If you rise from that, what is it, a failure or a beginning?" She said nothing, but I saw her grip on her folded notes begin to loosen. I knew then that another thread had quietly reconnected. That night, I sat beside my mother, who had just completed her final round of chemotherapy, and told her about the small event. She held my hand and smiled softly. "You've reclaimed something not everyone manages to hold on to after falling. Faith in yourself." I didn't reply. I just nodded, because it was true, in the end. That old fall had not taught me how to avoid being pushed down again. It taught me how to build my own ground, a place no one could step into without my permission. Some comebacks need no announcements, no stage lights, no framed accolades. They arrive like dawn slipping through a window, quiet but certain, 6 months after the day I first named Studio Afterlight. I was invited to the annual Media Innovation Summit in Austin, Texas, not as a speaker, but as the recipient of the Impact Through Integrity Award, honoring initiatives that redefine ethical standards in the industry. I didn't know who nominated me, and I didn't ask. I simply prepared a short speech, not to revisit the past, but to speak about how an idea built on truth, rather than tactics, can go further. On stage, I shared my journey from being betrayed, having my work stolen, and being pushed out, to the day I learned to return to the simplest foundation, believing in the worth of my own values and beginning again with small things. Done with intention. No names were mentioned, but the eyes in the audience said enough. They understood, because at some point, they too had either seen or been a version of Kelly in their own lives. When I returned to Seattle, Studio Afterlight secured its first nationwide strategic consulting contract with Green Table, a healthy food chain that had previously worked with Sterling and Rhodes but sought a new direction after internal disputes. I didn't chase clients, they came on their own, looking for something they no longer found in large agencies, a lasting commitment and storytelling without pretense. Every meeting with new partners began with a question I had written on the board: what meaningful thing are we creating? And for whom, not as a project brief, but as a reminder that behind every message is a human being, and sustainable relationships are built through listening, not marketing tricks. Meanwhile, news from Sterling and Rhodes grew sparse, not because they were more discreet, but because there was less worth reporting. A major campaign with a global beverage brand failed after it was revealed to have copied nearly the entire concept from a small Denver startup. Their quarterly revenue dropped by 19%, and social media engagement plummeted following the unresolved fallout from see-through. A friend sent me a leaked post from their internal staff forum that read, "We no longer know who writes the content anymore. Everything gets filtered through 5 layers of leadership that never see the ground." I read it, not with bitterness or smugness, just quietly closed the tab and went back to drafting content for the voices of the invisible campaign studio. Afterlight was creating for a nonprofit defending migrant worker rights. It wasn't a flashy project, didn't have a massive budget, but it was a space where I could return to what I once believed, telling the right story, to the right people, at the right time. Ryan never reached out again. I heard he lost speaking privileges after a failed meeting with a Japanese partner, a meeting that had been hoped to restore the company's reputation, but ended in extended silence and a handshake signaling indefinite termination. Betrayers don't always face consequences immediately, but those consequences seep in slowly, like water through a cracked foundation, silent but certain. I wasn't happy to hear it. No one should take joy in another's downfall. But I saw one thing clearly: if you choose the faster road by stepping on others, the cost may not be in the present, but in a future where your presence is no longer welcome. One October afternoon, I received a handwritten note from Velvet Echo. Inside was a single line: "Thank you for not stopping." I placed the card on my desk, next to a photo of my mother and her favorite chamomile teacup. Studio Afterlight now had a team of 6, not one of them from a big-name agency, but each had once been overlooked. I didn't call them employees. They were partners, each week. We held something called the Truth Hour, where anyone could share a past mistake without fear of judgment. I learned that when you build from fragments, you have to accept imperfection, but that very imperfection is what gives it depth. One day, near year's end, I stood in front of the mirror, without makeup or filters, and asked myself, if I had to start all over tomorrow, would I have the courage I didn't need to answer? I already knew. Perhaps that is the most important part of a comeback, not the shine, but the quiet perseverance to continue, even when no one is cheering, even when no one is watching. You keep going, because you know exactly where you're headed and why. I don't know if Ryan ever understood any of it, but maybe it doesn't matter anymore. Because revenge through success isn't about making someone else hurt. It's about not letting old pain stop you from moving forward. I carry no anger. I don't mention the names of those who hurt me in interviews. I don't need to teach anyone a lesson. I only need to do my part fully and let time teach the rest, because in the end, no one can deny one simple truth. Real value always finds its way back. If you are calm enough to wait, strong enough to hold it, and quiet enough to walk past all the noise. The first morning, I didn't have to go to the office. I sat on the porch holding a cup of cold coffee, staring blankly at the gray, misty sky of Seattle. No alarms, no deadlines, no colleagues watching, and no more Kelly Preston attached to Sterling Rhodes. A part of me had died in that boardroom, but another part, the one that had built everything from nothing, remained quietly present, beginning to wonder if my career had been stolen. Then why not build something new that no one could ever take away? That thought didn't arrive like a sudden flash of inspiration, but smoldered like a quiet ember, and I let it burn slowly, deliberately. I started again in the smallest way I knew how, clearing out the old home office in the corner of my apartment, the same corner that used to be just a backup for remote nights. I wiped the desk, sorted through old files, and opened the personal laptop I hadn't touched in months. In the folder labeled Projects, I found dozens of rejected drafts, campaigns shelved for being too off-brand or too emotional. Yet, as I reread them, I recognized a voice no report could quantify. It was mine, the one I'd silenced in my effort to keep others satisfied. From those scraps, I began to outline something new, not a company, not yet, but a startup plan built on a clear philosophy. Emotional marketing isn't about chasing trends. It's about forging real human connections. A few days later, I met Thomas Bloom, a freelance photographer I had worked with on past campaigns, at a small cafe in Capitol Hill. He asked what I was doing, and I simply said I was exploring a new path where stories didn't need a KPI sheet to prove they mattered. Thomas said nothing then, but by the end of the meeting, he handed me a list of 5 local brands seeking media consultants in the aftermath of the pandemic. One was a small organic tea brand founded by a single mother. I reached out that same night, and after a 2-hour Zoom call, we agreed to a 1-month trial consulting project. No official contract, just a promise sealed in an email. But to me, it was the first step towards standing up again. The challenge came in the very first week. No marketing budget, no design team. Everything had to be built from scratch. I worked alone, brainstorming ideas, writing copy, shooting videos on my phone, and editing footage with free software. Every skill I had once taught others, I now had to relearn for myself. There were nights I stayed up past 3 a.m. just to get one video to hit the right emotional chord. What I didn't expect was the message from the client after that first video went live. I cried watching this. Thank you for helping me see that my product has a soul. I read that line over and over, taking it as confirmation that I still had value, with no business card and no glossy office to prove it. Still, comebacks are never linear. In the 3rd week, my mother collapsed in the bathroom. The diagnosis revealed the illness was progressing faster than we had hoped. I had to devote more time to her care, take her to radiation sessions, manage her medication, monitor her vitals. I had to cancel client meetings without notice, and some days I couldn't even touch my laptop because I was simply too drained. There were moments when I wanted to quit, convinced that my efforts were far too small to stand against the tide of what kept crashing in. But then I remembered why I started, not to prove anything to anyone, but to remind myself that I was never meant to be a supporting character in someone else's story. One evening, as I sat quietly by my mother's bedside, she placed her hand on my shoulder and said, "Do you know why I always insisted on cooking every meal, even when I was exhausted? Because I wanted you to understand that even small things, when done with heart, can be enough to sustain another person." Her words stirred something in me. I began to rebuild my business model from that simple truth. A blog dedicated to telling the brand stories of women who had once been overlooked. A podcast sharing content creation skills that were honest and unfiltered. I didn't call it a company. I called it Studio Afterlight, the light that follows a storm. Meanwhile, on LinkedIn, news broke that See-Through had won another international award. And this time, Ryan Caldwell stood alone on stage, trophy in hand, thanking a remarkable creative team for bringing the vision to life. He didn't mention me. No one from the old firm did. But strangely enough, a week later, I received a message from a former colleague asking if I had time to share a few tips on building low-budget campaigns. I knew what it meant. They had started to feel the absence. I didn't reply immediately. I took a few more days to finalize the legal paperwork for Studio Afterlight. There was no physical office, but there was a clear mission, no flashy client list, but there was real trust. Through betrayal and being pushed out, I began to rebuild relationships on my own terms, one story at a time, one small brand at a time, for people who truly needed honest support, not spectacle. I no longer needed anyone to validate that I was good enough. I only needed to be steady enough not to break again.